It's easy to hide a dead body in the woods. You just bring a couple of shovels and bury it, or if you're feeling lazy, you could just throw it in a river. Dead men don't float, after all. But there's one place you should never hide a dead body: inside a medieval castle. Because when the locals found out you committed murder, they might put your body count on display for everyone to see. Welcome back to the channel. In the medieval world, the idea of a body count wasn't hidden in whispers or turned into an awkward statistic. It was often celebrated. Kings, knights, mercenaries, and even chroniclers loved to exaggerate the numbers of enemies defeated. The bigger the number, the bigger the glory. And nobody wanted to look like a small fry in the glory department. One of the earliest examples comes from the Norman knight William Marshal, often called the greatest knight who ever lived. Chroniclers described him as a man who fought in over 500 tournaments and countless battles. Supposedly, he defeated hundreds of opponents in single combat and killed countless more on the battlefield. Did he really? Not exactly. Most medieval sources were written to glorify lords and make enemies sound weak. But in William Marshal's case, his reputation was enough to make him one of the most feared men in Christendom. Another famous case is Richard the Lionheart, the Crusader king. During the siege of Acre in 1191, supposedly Richard personally cut down dozens of enemies. Some chroniclers even claimed he had over 1,000 kills attributed to him during his campaigns. That number is almost certainly exaggerated, but Richard loved the reputation. He carried a massive sword, rode in the front lines, and deliberately made himself look unstoppable, because the bigger the body count, the stronger the legend. But these body counts weren't always personal. Sometimes rulers bragged about entire armies slaughtering villages, just to terrify their enemies. The Mongols, for instance, made a habit of exaggerating numbers. One chronicle claimed they killed 700,000 people in Nishapur in 1221. The real number? Probably closer to 70,000, but still terrifying. So why did medieval people love exaggerating the body count so much? Part of it, as we said before, was to bolster a warrior's reputation. In a world without reliable statistics or even calendars, coming up with big, scary numbers was a way to intimidate potential enemies and rally allies. Plus, when your name is Richard and you want to be known as Richard the Lionheart, having a high body count helps. Another reason for exaggerating the body count is that death was just part of everyday life in the Middle Ages. People died from things we would consider mundane today, like childbirth or a bad fall. So when chroniclers described a battle where one side lost countless men, it didn't necessarily mean the outcome was a massacre. It just meant a lot of people died. Finally, there was no real way to verify the body count, so anyone could claim to have killed anyone. In 1473, King Edward IV of England came up with a more realistic number than usual. When he wrote that he had slain not less than 25,000 rebels at the Battle of Tewkesbury, he was almost certainly lying. But he was also close to the real number of casualties. Now watch how medieval armor really worked, or check out this video instead. Did you know that history's most prolific serial killer is a little-known Romanian prince? Well, you may have heard of him. He was the inspiration for Bram Stoker's creation, the infamous Count Dracula. This man of the night earned his dark reputation by bathing in blood, torturing enemies and dipping his bread in blood instead of wine, and he did it all with a smile. Yep, this real-life Dracula actually existed. And if Vlad the Impaler had a personal record for body count, he would have topped the list. Now, before we begin our countdown, please click like and subscribe to stay up to date with our future videos. Let's start. Number 10. For Vlad the Impaler, violence was a feast for the eyes. And no spectacle gave him more pleasure than watching people die slowly. One of his favorite methods involved pouring boiling oil or molten metal down a victim's throat. It was a fate worse than death, a fate that burned them alive from the inside out. What makes this even more horrifying is that Vlad didn't limit this torture to his enemies. In 1448, he hosted a banquet where he allegedly poured molten gold down the throats of 100 nobles who couldn't afford their taxes. Nobles, ladies and gentlemen, that's how Vlad got the title the Impaler. He wasn't just violent, he was unimaginably cruel. As the Prince of Wallachia, he ruled like a god over his people, and if they displeased him, they were impaled. Peasants, soldiers, merchants, no one was safe. Even Vlad's wife and son didn't escape his wrath. During a hunting trip in 1462, he ordered his wife, Princess Sinina, to be impaled because she disobeyed him by picking up a chicken that he wanted to chase. And when his son Radu tried to plead for her, he too met the same fate. Yes, even the royal family wasn't spared from the prince's unhinged impulses. But Vlad's favorite way to eliminate his subjects was, well, traditional impalement. His brutality earned him both fame and infamy throughout Europe. Once he unleashed a fury on a group of boyars, the medieval Russian term for nobles, who opposed his rule. In one fell swoop, he had all 40 of them impaled outside his palace. Vlad also delighted in punishing entire communities. When a group of Jewish moneylenders criticized his spending habits, he retaliated by impaling 300 Jews in Targovik. Vlad's regime was a reign of terror. If you lived in Wallachia during his rule, you never knew when you'd end up on the wrong side of the prince's temper. And if that happened, your life expectancy dropped to 0 in a heartbeat. But Vlad the Impaler wasn't just a tyrant. He was also a military genius, which is why he earned the title Dracula. Yes, that's the same Dracula that Stoker used for his infamous character. Vlad's strategic brilliance helped him repel Ottoman invasions, earning him the respect and fear of his enemies. One of his most famous victories came in 1462. However, despite his military successes and strategic brilliance, Vlad the Impaler's legacy has been overshadowed by his penchant for extreme violence and bloodshed, and who can blame us? After all, he earned the nickname Son of the Dragon for a reason. Thank you for watching today's video. Remember to subscribe for more informative historical tales. Vlad the Impaler is a legendary figure whose brutal deeds are said to have left a lasting impact on history. Some say he dipped his bread in blood, and others claim he dipped his entire kingdom in it. But while Vlad's kills might sound terrifying, they're just the tip of the medieval iceberg. Welcome to my channel. Today we'll be exploring the life and times of a medieval monster who made Vlad the Impaler look like a walk in the park. So grab a snack, sit back, and get ready for a journey through the Dark Ages. Timur, also known as Tamerlane, was a Central Asian conqueror who lived in the 14th century. While history remembers him as a brilliant military strategist and founder of the Timurid Empire, his name strikes fear into the hearts of many. Timur wasn't your average medieval warrior. He led massive armies that swept across Persia, India, and the Middle East, leaving behind a trail of death and destruction. But what sets Timur apart from other medieval monsters is the sheer scale of his alleged body count. The man was a one-man army, or maybe I should say one-man apocalypse. When Timur set his sights on a city, he didn't just want to defeat its army. He wanted the whole place wiped off the map. And let me tell you, he did not disappoint. One of Timur's most infamous acts of violence occurred when he captured Delhi in 1398, according to chroniclers. His forces slaughtered 100,000 captives in one day. Imagine the carnage, the screams, the despair. It's enough to make your blood run cold. But Delhi was just the beginning. In Baghdad, Timur supposedly ordered the creation of 90,000 skull pyramids made from the heads of the dead. Talk about a killer party foul. And in Isfahan, he allegedly killed 200,000 people after a rebellion. Throughout his campaigns across Persia, India, and the Middle East, Timur's armies were said to have caused the deaths of 17 million people. That's a truly staggering number. Even if some historians argue that it's a bit of an exaggeration. Of course, many of these statistics were exaggerated by chroniclers who wanted to make Timur seem like a world-ending monster. But whether the real number was millions or not, the destruction was undeniable. What makes Timur's body count so fascinating is that unlike knights or kings who bragged about their swordsmanship, Timur's reputation was about numbers so big they became terrifying myths. He wasn't known for his skill in battle, but for the sheer scale of his conquests. His enemies weren't defeated. They were annihilated. His victories weren't celebrated with parades, but with pyramids of skulls. It's important to remember that these numbers represent real people. Countless lives cut short by the ruthless ambition of a single man. Behind each statistic is a story of loss, of families torn apart, and of entire civilizations wiped out. As you munch on your snack, I want you to think about the weight of these numbers, the human cost of Timur's conquests. What would you do with such power? How would you feel knowing that you've caused the deaths of millions? Timur's legacy is a reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the human heart. He was a brilliant military strategist, yes, but he was also a monster. A monster who dipped his empire in blood and left a stain on history that has never faded. While Vlad the Impaler may have dipped his bread in blood, Timur blanketed his lands in it. And that, my friends, is why he is the real medieval monster. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the Dark Ages. I hope you learned something new and maybe even discovered a new favorite monster. Remember to stay tuned for more epic tales and to let me know in the comments which historical horror stories you'd like to see covered in future episodes. Until then, keep an eye out for those pesky time travelers and beware of semi-mystical 14th century conquerors. You never know when they might pop up and dip their bread in blood. Or maybe that was just Vlad. How many people did even the terrible kill? How about Genghis Khan? And what about that nice guy Hitler? When we think of the deadliest people ever, we usually picture megalomaniacal dictators and evil geniuses. But sometimes the worst offenders are more relatable. Take Edward of Woodstock, better known as the Black Prince. He was one of the most famous English commanders during the 100 Years' War, and at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, his forces crushed the French army, killing thousands and capturing the French king himself. Chroniclers celebrated him as a noble warrior. But off the battlefield, things got darker. During his campaign in France, Edward ordered entire towns burned. Civilians slaughtered and farmland destroyed, what we call scorched earth tactics. His soldiers killed thousands of peasants, not for glory, but simply to weaken France. He wasn't alone. Medieval warfare often included chevauchées, raids designed to rack up civilian casualties. Knights who bragged about body counts weren't necessarily fighting other knights. They were killing villagers who couldn't fight back. The irony is that chivalry, the knightly code of honor, was often more about appearances than mercy. A knight could cut down 100 peasants, burn 3 villages, and still be considered honorable as long as he bowed politely and went to church on Sunday. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for knights to massacre entire populations that had literally done nothing wrong. In 1294, a Welsh knight named Sir Rhys ap Meredith led an invasion of Ireland with a force of about 2,000 men. Their mission: slaughter the Irish. According to legend, when they finished, the ground was littered with the bodies of 2,000 Irish nobles, 10,000 commoners, and 200 priests. That's like the Black Death, only way more personal. Now, back then it was considered heroic to kill lots of people. But how do you get that many kills without being an invincible killing machine? Well, medieval warriors didn't have to be super strong or super fast. They just needed numbers on their side. Think about it. A heavily armored knight could only swing his sword about twice a minute, maybe 3 times if he was really fast. So in an hour, he might score a respectable 5 kills. But that same knight could lead a group of 100 men and indirectly order them to kill 1,000 people. That's what we call efficiency. Of course, these massacres weren't exactly surgical. Men, women, and children died alongside the soldiers. But to the medieval mind, that was the point. Entire populations were guilty by association. If you lived in a town that supported the king, then you were the enemy. And for some rulers, killing civilians was a way to send a message. In 1477, the future Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, led an invasion of northern Italy. He wanted to punish the city of Milan for supporting his enemies. So he laid siege to the place, and when his troops entered the city, they went nuts. They killed between 1,000 and 2,000 civilians, including women and children. It was brutal, but not all that unusual. Between 1300 and 1600, at least 10 European cities were sacked by rival nobles. Civilians were routinely murdered, tortured, and raped. In other words, life was pretty sweet if you were a medieval warrior, as long as you weren't a civilian. These days we tend to think of war as a battle between 2 armies, a clash of good and evil. But before modern times, warfare was a little more complicated. Soldiers didn't just fight each other, they also battled entire populations. The goal was to defeat not just an army but an entire nation, no matter the cost. These ruthless tactics helped English commanders conquer Wales, Ireland, and much of France. And it wasn't just brute force, it was also psychological warfare. The goal was to terrorize entire populations into submission. By the 13th century, European knights were already wearing terrifying armor. They looked like demons straight out of hell. But some commanders took things further. Take, for instance, the Swedish king who invaded Finland in 1157. His soldiers wore wolf pelts and bear skins, while others dressed as hairy wild men. Some commanders dressed as hairy wild men because, let's face it, there's nothing more terrifying than a knight dressed as a hairy wild man. And if that didn't work, there was always Plan B, just show the locals what your army was really made of. What's the best way to get an accurate count of those killed in battle? Well, how about we not count them? If anyone mastered the art of turning mass killing into legend, it was the Crusaders. Over 8 centuries, European Christians launched a series of holy wars against fellow Christians in the East and Muslims in the Middle East and North Africa. And while today we think of the Crusades as brutal and extreme for medieval Europeans, killing in the name of God was a glorious thing. And body counts weren't just about measuring victory. They were about heaven, propaganda, and sending a terrifying message. God is on our side, so your death is justified. Let's look at one of the most infamous massacres in medieval history, and maybe the most infamous massacre, period. The siege of Jerusalem in 1099 during the First Crusade. The siege itself was long and brutal. And when the Crusaders finally breached the city walls, they unleashed a bloodbath. Medieval chroniclers wrote with disturbing pride that when the Crusaders captured the city, they killed nearly 70,000 Muslims and Jews. One account even claimed the streets ran ankle-deep in blood. But the craziest part is that to the Crusaders, this wasn't a shameful slaughter. It was a holy victory. Massive body counts like this were painted as proof of divine favor. In fact, medieval knights who fought in the Crusades were often described as bathed in blood. And killing as many people as possible was actually seen as a path to salvation. So, when the Crusaders seized Jerusalem, they didn't bother counting the dead because they knew God had already done it for them. He'd granted them victory. That was all that mattered. For example, the chronicler Fulcher of Chartres wrote that, after God helped the Crusaders capture Jerusalem, they put the inhabitants of the city to the sword and did not spare man or woman, nor child or infant. He then added, thus was the city of Jerusalem captured, and for 8 days they went on killing every living creature in it, friend and foe alike. After the siege, he claimed, no one could number the bodies because they were lying in heaps together. Nor, indeed, could they be counted even if one were to go looking for them, so forget counting them, right? God did that for them, and it seems like he did a thorough job. Fulcher continued, there were indeed heaps of the slain both outside and inside the city walls, and some were piled up against the towers and the gates, and others lay in the very center of the city, and others were thrown down into the moat so that the blood ran ankle deep in some places. You get the idea. In Crusader propaganda, Jerusalem was drenched in the blood of infidels, and that was glorious. But what about when the Crusaders turned on other Christians? From July to June 1204, the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Tens of thousands were killed, women were assaulted in churches, and the city was stripped bare. What did the chroniclers say? Well, for many of them, this wasn't even considered sinful, sacking a Christian city. Writing about the sack of Constantinople, one chronicler said, you have never heard of such terrible havoc, such a universal destruction by fire, sword, water. By every kind of destruction, I mean by day or by night. Another wrote, when once they entered the city, it seemed as though God himself had given the Christians over to their fury. So, again, the emphasis wasn't on counting the dead. It was on the destruction, on sending a message to other Christian rulers who opposed the Crusaders. In reality, the Crusaders had no interest in preserving the memory of those they slaughtered. After all, they believed those people were damned anyway. Rather, they wanted to inspire terror among their enemies, so forget about body counts. In Crusader propaganda, there was no accounting for the dead. God took care of them. And if the Crusaders won, then that meant God was on their side? What better proof of divine favor than that? I'm the author of a book about the Crusades. So what do we make of all these insane medieval body counts? The truth is, most of them are wildly exaggerated. Chroniclers inflated numbers to make rulers seem scarier, braver, or more divinely chosen. When they said a king killed 1,000 men in one day, the real number might have been 50. When they claimed entire cities were wiped out, often a large portion of the population survived. But exaggeration was the point. Numbers weren't about accuracy, they were about power. A body count of 100,000, whether true or not, was a way to paralyze enemies with fear. In a world without mass media, stories of insane killings spread faster than facts. If you heard Timur killed 200,000 people in Isfahan, you didn't ask for sources. You just surrendered before he came to your town. The craziest thing about medieval body counts isn't the blood or even the exaggerations, it's how effective they were. Terror became a weapon, and numbers, no matter how inflated, were the sharpest blade of all. When Genghis Khan's armies marched through Persia in the 13th century, they left a bloody path in their wake. But exactly how many people died is a mystery lost to time. What we know comes from chroniclers who wrote centuries after the fact, long after the Mongols had come and gone. They tell tales of entire cities wiped off the map, of massacres so gruesome they sound made up, of rivers so choked with corpses they backed up the flow of time itself. Did any of it really happen? Almost certainly some of it did. But separating fact from fiction is impossible. And maybe that's by design. What if the Mongols weren't just great conquerors but also great propagandists? When a ruler has a big army and a taste for blood, there's an easy way to strike terror into the hearts of potential enemies. Boast about how many people you've killed. A rumor of 200,000 dead is far more persuasive than a list of 20 battles and 10,000 total casualties. That kind of body count can stop a war before it starts. We can see this in the wars between the Crusader states and Saladin. When the Muslim leader recaptured Jerusalem in 1187, his chronicler said he'd killed or captured 200,000 Crusaders. The number isn't plausible, but that doesn't mean it wasn't effective. European chroniclers got wind of the massacre and spun their own tales of death and suffering, which led to decades of retaliatory violence. None of those crusades against the Muslims succeeded, and it's hard to say how much the body counts mattered. But it's also hard to say they didn't have an impact at all. Timur, the 14th century conqueror known as Timur the Lame, had a similar problem. He spent his life ruling a small state in what is now Uzbekistan. But his armies rampaged across Persia, Iraq, and Turkey, sacking cities and slaughtering people. How many people? Well, his own chronicler said 17 million, which is an awful lot, even for someone as accomplished as Timur, but that's not stopping historians from taking the claim seriously. Turns out it's pretty easy to get lost in the weeds of medieval statistics. There's such a tangled mess of conflicting accounts and wild claims that it's tough to know where to start. So historians have done what anyone would do when faced with bad data. They've thrown out the old methods and made up new ones. A few years ago, one team of researchers published a statistical study of Timur's conquests. They took every city he supposedly attacked and calculated how many people could have possibly died there, based on population size and the amount of destruction. Then they compared that to the chroniclers' body counts and found that, Timur probably didn't kill 17 million people. Instead, the researchers offered their own estimate, something Timur might actually be able to plausibly have killed in the number of people who died over the course of his entire empire. Somewhere between 600,000 and 1.9 million. Still a huge range, but at least it's a believable one. And still, even if we accept this new estimate, that's still an awful lot of people to die. To put it in perspective, that's equivalent to the total number of deaths from warfare in the entire 20th century. Over just a few years, Timur's armies reportedly killed as many people as every war of the deadliest century in human history. Now, you can call me cynical, but I find it hard to believe that any ruler, no matter how brutal, could really be that effective. Even if his chronicler was inflating his stats by a factor of 10 or 20 or 100. But that's the thing about medieval body counts. Even if we know they're wrong, we don't necessarily know how wrong. We can try to calculate the upper or lower bounds, the plausible ranges, the outliers, but maybe they're all outliers. Maybe every number is as good as any other. And if that's the case, then maybe we should just give up on getting to the bottom of Timur's body count. Or, better yet, we should give up on trying to pin down any of them. Because the truth is, none of them matter. Genghis Khan may not have killed 200,000 people in Persia, but that doesn't mean his armies didn't terrorize the region. Saladin might not have slaughtered 200,000 Crusaders, but that doesn't mean Jerusalem wasn't a massacre. Timur may not have killed 17 million people, but that doesn't mean his rampage across Persia wasn't devastating. By the standards of medieval warfare, all three men were probably very effective. When we hear modern estimates, it's tempting to dismiss them as too high or too low, real or fake. But maybe we shouldn't worry so much about whether a massacre was really a massacre, and instead we should focus on the bigger picture. The fact that these numbers stuck around so long because our fascination with the past isn't really about facts and figures. It's about stories, about the human need to understand the world and ourselves by reliving the dramatic moments that have shaped our past. He led his armies across Asia and Europe, leaving behind a bloody trail of destruction. He built one of the largest empires in history, and his name still strikes fear into the hearts of many. Meet Genghis Khan, the man who changed the course of history. It is said that he was born under a blood moon, a harbinger of the violence that would follow. On October 24, 1162, in the rolling grasslands of Mongolia, Temujin was born. The future Genghis Khan, his father Yasuge, was a chieftain, but soon after Temujin's birth, he and his family were attacked by a rival clan. Temujin's mother, Holin, watched helplessly as her husband was poisoned and his men were slaughtered. She knew that her family was next, so she grabbed her children and fled. Holin and her kids were on the run for years, surviving on their wits and whatever food they could find. It was a desperate struggle, but Temujin's will to survive was stronger than any threat. Slowly, he and his siblings grew up, hardened by the harsh realities of life on the Mongolian steppe. At age 9, Temujin was captured along with his father's men. They were enslaved in a camp where he suffered greatly. Years passed and Temujin refused to accept defeat. With the help of his wife, he escaped and regrouped with his family. By age 16, Temujin had proven himself to be a fierce warrior. He raided neighboring tribes and built a reputation as a skilled fighter and cunning strategist. Soon, he was known throughout the land as Genghis Khan, which means Ocean of Wrath. But Genghis didn't stop at being just a warrior. He was a visionary leader who united the nomadic tribes of Mongolia into one powerful force. Under his banner, the Mongols became a well-oiled fighting machine, disciplined and organized in ways they had never been before. Genghis established a merit-based society where loyalty and competence were rewarded, not social status or wealth. His army, composed of skilled horsemen and archers, was unmatched on the battlefield. They swept through northern China, conquering city after city. Along the way, Genghis established trading routes and encouraged cultural exchange, laying the foundation for the Pax Mongolica, a period of relative peace and stability across his vast empire. But Genghis Khan's legacy is not just about building an empire. It's also about destroying those who stood in his way. As he expanded his empire, he faced fierce resistance, especially from the Western Xia dynasty. In 1179, he launched a devastating attack, killing tens of thousands and capturing their emperor. But perhaps his most brutal campaign was against the Quraysh tribe in 1219. When they refused to submit to his rule, he responded with unrelenting force. The Mongols laid siege to the city, cutting off its water supply and bombarding it with catapults. When the city fell, they went on a rampage, killing everyone in sight. Historians estimate that over 100,000 people were killed in the siege and massacre. Genghis Khan died in 1227 at the age of 65. He left behind an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe, a legacy that would influence the course of history for centuries to come. But as we look back, we must remember the ocean of wrath that he embodied. For Genghis Khan was not just a great leader and visionary. He was also a ruthless killer who left a trail of blood and destruction in his wake. Today, Genghis Khan is remembered as one of the greatest conquerors in history. His empire was vast and his military tactics were brilliant, but he was also a brutal ruler who cared little for human life. In fact, he is believed to have ordered the killing of millions of people. Genghis Khan may have been a historical figure, but his actions still have relevance today. We live in a world where violence and destruction are all too common, and it's important to remember the dangers of unchecked power. Genghis Khan was a reminder of that. Do you know of any other ruler with a similar body count? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. Thank you for watching. So far, our list has been filled with men who built reputations on slaughter. But let's flip the script. Joan of Arc, one of the most famous figures of the late medieval era, also had a body count just of a very different kind. Joan wasn't a butcher like Vlad or Timur. She wasn't even a commander in the traditional sense. She was a teenage peasant girl who claimed divine visions told her to drive the English out of France during the 100 Years' War. At just 17 years old, she led French troops to major victories, including the Siege of Orleans. Her body count wasn't measured in direct kills. In fact, Joan herself rarely fought with her sword. She carried a banner instead. But the battles she inspired caused thousands of deaths. Chroniclers estimate that at Orleans alone, more than 4,000 English soldiers were killed or captured. At Patay, French forces crushed the English, killing thousands more. What makes Joan stand out is how her body count was framed. Instead of being painted as a butcher, she was celebrated as a saintly warrior. French writers described her victories as miraculous, guided by God, rather than soaked in blood. Yet, in the end, Joan herself became part of another kind of medieval death count. Captured by the English, she was burned at the stake in 1431. Her executioners thought they were killing one heretic, but they accidentally created one of the most enduring legends in medieval history. Joan's story reminds us that body counts weren't always about slaughter. Sometimes they were about inspiration, faith, and the strange ways war turns individuals into symbols. The art of killing isn't just about the act itself. It's also about what you do with the reputation it brings you. Genghis Khan, Timur, and Vlad the Impaler all understood this. For them, cultivating a fearsome image was as important as the conquests themselves. But not every conqueror follows this playbook. Meet Timur the Lame, also known as Emir Timur. He's less famous than Genghis, but his claim to the title of history's deadliest man is pretty strong. His body count is estimated to be somewhere between 17 and 20 million people, making him one of the deadliest men in human history. Timur's empire stretched from modern-day Turkey to Mongolia. Like Genghis, he built a reputation for extreme cruelty. His armies reportedly used poison, biological warfare, and torture as weapons. However, unlike Genghis, Timur's legacy is shrouded in mystery. Unlike Genghis, who founded the Mongol Empire, Timur was an outsider. He was the founder of the Turco-Mongol dynasty of the Timurids. His empire was a mix of nomadic Mongol traditions and the settled societies of Persia. This made him both more complex and less iconic. Historians have struggled to fit him into the traditional narratives of good versus evil. He wasn't a ruthless villain. He kept slaves and mistreated women, but he was also generous to scholars and built impressive public works. While Genghis was motivated by a desire for plunder and conquest, Timur seems to have been driven by a more personal quest for power and prestige. His empire was based on conquest, but he also tried to legitimize it through propaganda and historical narratives. Timur died in 1405, leaving behind a legacy that continues to fascinate and repulse us in equal measure. Vlad the Impaler doesn't hold the title of deadliest ruler. That probably belongs to someone like Timur. But Vlad carved out a unique space in history by embracing the title of monster. That might have been exactly what he wanted. After all, when you're trying to strike fear into your enemies, it helps to have a scary reputation. Vlad the Impaler may have been aiming for the Iron Throne, but he ended up on the path to infamy. When you think of medieval monsters, Vlad the Impaler might be top of the list. His record as ruler of Wallachia in the 15th century included some seriously messed up stuff. We're talking executing boyars, those powerful medieval nobles, by throwing them out of windows and having a thing for wooden stakes, the classic monster stuff. And then there's that whole executing people by wooden stake thing, something you'd expect from a certain type of person. But Vlad took it to a whole new level. He was even said to dip his bread in blood. Yikes. Talk about a recipe for disaster. But Vlad's brutality wasn't just about scaring people, it was also about gaining power. By taking out the boyars, he reduced opposition and consolidated his rule. And while we might see dipping your bread in blood as crazy in medieval Europe, it was actually a symbol of power. By showing off his wealth and influence, Vlad was sending a message to other rulers, don't mess with me. So while Vlad the Impaler might not have been the deadliest ruler, he definitely made a name for himself as a hardcore medieval monster. He proved that sometimes the path to power is paved with blood and stakes, but hey, at least he made a memorable impression. Historians argue about how many people died in the Mongol Empire's conquests, but most agree that Genghis Khan sits at the top of the food chain, metaphorically speaking, of course. His empire stretched from China to Eastern Europe, and his armies reportedly killed anyone who didn't submit to their rule. Genghis Khan was the founder of the Mongol Empire, which at its peak stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. He united the nomadic Mongol tribes and built a reputation as a brilliant military strategist and ruthless conqueror. But Genghis Khan's body count goes beyond just the battlefield. His armies targeted entire populations, not just opposing armies. Cities that resisted the Mongols often faced brutal punishments, including torture, enslavement, and total destruction. The most famous example is the city of Baghdad, which was sacked by the Mongols in 1258. The destruction of Baghdad is considered one of the worst disasters in Islamic history. According to historians, hundreds of thousands of people were killed, perhaps even millions. What set Genghis Khan apart was his ability to unite disparate groups under his banner and use that unity to conquer vast territories. He was also a master of psychological warfare, terrifying his enemies before battle by sending them messages describing his past atrocities. But Genghis Khan wasn't just a bloodthirsty conqueror, he was also a shrewd politician and administrator. He established a sophisticated postal system, promoted religious tolerance, and encouraged trade along his empire's famous Silk Road. Even today, Genghis Khan remains a legendary figure, both feared and revered. His story continues to fascinate people around the world. These men of the medieval era left their mark on history through the sheer scale of their impact. Whether it was the territorial expansion of empires or the establishment of brutal regimes, these medieval men carved out legacies that continue to resonate in our collective memory. They serve as chilling reminders of the darker aspects of human nature, proving that throughout history, the lust for power and dominance has often taken center stage. But it's not just their impact that made them so influential. It's also how they managed to maintain their power and influence. From strategic alliances to the creation of efficient bureaucracies, these men knew how to secure their positions. In doing so, they laid the foundation for future dynasties and shaped the political landscape of their time. But perhaps most importantly, these men offer a cautionary tale. Their stories serve as reminders of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the importance of balancing power with wisdom and restraint. Thanks for watching. See you next time.